and you don't know whether this is a room that is waiting to be filled, whether it was filled and now is completely abandoned, whether there was, you don't know what happened. And if you take the caption away, if you take Goa away from this photograph, or the house that it might have been, and I can guess which house it may have been, then the photograph allows, then you allow the photograph to work its magic on you, instead of getting bogged down by the where and the when of the photograph. And I think I'm very, very grateful to Geeta and Umaima and the trust that put this book together, because I know it was a dream for many, many years for Nagarajan to have his book come out. Many people tried, and I tried too, and we were almost at the time of signing the contract. But Nagarajan, as the author of his work, wanted a certain size, wanted a certain kind of text. He didn't really want some anonymous person to be writing a foreword for his book. He wanted to determine how his book is made. So he was not an easy, whatever you would call, to a publisher. And it's fantastic that Geeta and Umaima were able to do this, I feel very sad to say, but within his lifetime, because most of us that tried gave up, because it just, I think his photographs were just too quiet. They're like little whispers, and only when you listen will the rest of the drama unfold. There is a lot more to it than what you think there is. I could spend a day or weeks with just this one print, because it allows me to make so many readings, so many different issues come up, and they are not just what Nagarajan wanted to tell me. He has created the space in these photographs for me to build my own stories, which would change according to my moods. So I made a few points of things I really wanted to say, where I felt that in the light that he was photographing, if one can dare in this day and age to talk about something like spirituality, I always felt a certain innate spirituality in Nagarajan's work, as though he was of course a lover of the light, but there was more to his making the pictures. There are other people who worked at the same time, who worked in areas close to his, in regions close to his. But there is something about Nagarajan's work where I could really say he's one of our finest photographers. And I call him a photographer because that's how he's known. But here I would like to say that I don't think Nagarajan is a photographer. He is much, much more than a photographer. He is the author of his work. In this photograph, this is the one print that, because of my obsession with files, and we have many similar obsessions. I started with a picture of the chairs. This is an image where I can really sort of wander around the papers. I can look at them more closely in a larger print or in the book. But I can also imagine some of the conversations that might have happened. And I'm not even sure I like the man who's photographed. But then I think all of them also really were very comfortable with Nagarajan. And I think the best illustration of how Nagarajan worked is if I could request Bernard Imhasli to describe how T.S. Nagarajan came to his house in the mid-80s to photograph at the time that he was photographing for the Taj magazine. It's a collector's issue, that Delhi issue of Taj magazine that T.S. Nagarajan photographed. So Bernard, if you could just describe to us how he, come here and describe? Yes. Or we can all hear you also from there. Okay.
It's just a short story. Really, I was asked by Dianita I just mentioned this experience of Nagarajan when he photographed our home, which was then in Delhi. And it was for the Taj magazine, an issue on Delhi, and we didn't know him, we didn't know who he was, and we are kind of, as you expect a photographer to be when he comes into your home, an intruder. And
Tell us a little more about that.
So he arrived at, I think about 6:30 in the morning. He had announced himself that he would arrive a little early with Meenakshi, and very kindly asked and said, "Can I set up my tripod?" Which he did.
Yeah.
Which he did, and then he did that, and then they sat down, Meenakshi and he, and we kind of wanted to be social and offered tea and so. And they said, "No, don't worry," and they just sat there and waited in silence. You know, we also fell silent, you know, suddenly, because we thought, you know, this is something we should respect. And then at one point, I think it was about half an hour later, I think Meenakshi told him, "I think the light is right now." And he said yes, and he got up and stood behind the tripod and made a shot. Clicked, and that was it.
One or two.
Yeah, he did a few, and then that was it, and then he moved to another part of the house. Maybe I have to add, it was a small house that Charles Correa had built, of which he had been oblivious until we told him that he had built that house. And of course, being Delhi, he had experimented a little bit with the issue, an architectural issue of the light that you need in a house. At the same time, you need coolness, and coolness means not too much light. So that to get that balance between shade and light, coolness and warmth, he had done quite a special house. It was quite a beautiful place. And I felt for the first time I got this when Nagarajan was there, because then he moved the camera to another place, again they waited, and again. So they spent 2 days just taking, I think finally there were about 3 shots in the magazine, or 4, and he had presented us his little portfolio of the photographs, and I think there were about a dozen. That was it. And I mean, you mentioned the spiritual aspect of it, and I think that really was a spiritual moment for me, most unexpected, and I think he really introduced us to our house, which we, I think, loved, but loved even more after he had come and gone.
That's really the most beautiful tribute to Nagarajan, more than anything we could say or do, but we'll still plod along. No, it's fine, it's fine.
So I just
go through the other images that I had marked out. And these were the images where the people just seemed to have, it was as though the slowness of Nagarajan's photography had somehow become part of them. And I sort of recognize when that happens when one is making photographs. I frankly wouldn't know how to do that with a digital camera. I'm always anxious when there are photographers around and when they go bang, bang, bang at me or at you or anybody else. And with somehow the tripod, which is anyway the gift of time, and photography, the gift of light, that Nagarajan found a beautiful balance between the two, which allows for so many different interpretations for all the writers in the room. I'm sure you would agree with me that there is an entire novel to be written in this one photograph, or this one, or this one. I mean, he brought so many different elements into the work, and I will just come to that in a little while. But right now, I thought we would just look at what is it in these photographs that makes them so mesmerizing that you never forget. And I wonder how much of an influence that Taj magazine issue had on the photography that I went on to do. It was so, I mean, now when I look at the chairs photo, I've even been to the same house. I have this light that pours through the back window. I mean, who can say what comes from where? That's another portrait where I felt that it wasn't about a single shot, that there were hours and hours in that portrait. That it was not, he didn't just make the picture and run away, that he stayed. And like Bernard said, it changed Bernard's reading of the space. And I think at its best, when photographers are truly authors of their work and inhabit the space and make the images, that there is a different reading that can come. I, of course, like to tell all photographers to go to schools of literature and say, you know, then come to photography, that you'll bring something else. But I also say to my architect friends, or if I ever have to speak in a school of architecture, you must have a course in photography so you understand light and you understand what changes happen during the day. And clearly Meenakshi was very much the partner of Nagarajan, telling him, now I think the light is right. And then I thought of the idea of the archive, and I thought of what will happen to Nagarajan's archive. And suppose he wanted to leave it somewhere. Where could he leave it? And I mean, I'm so happy that this book got made. So there will be some record of his work, because there's that one issue of the Taj magazine, but that, as I said, is the collector's issue, so difficult to find. But we have this book now, and so there is something will remain of his work. But there is a much larger archive. From this book also I can tell that there are many possibilities. So for example, I now make what I call photo architecture, and I make museums. And I'm making a museum of photography, which is not really a museum of photos taken by contemporary photographers or older photographers, but it's a museum about how we live with photography. And I thought, if I could have the run of Nagarajan's archive, I would love to make a museum, and clearly that's a theme in his work, of how we live with photography. You've seen that in some of the earlier images, but I thought I would just sharpen that focus. And there's another book waiting to be done there, which is Nagarajan's images of people living with photography, living with images. Do you see what I mean? That while it's also about architecture, it's also about light, it's about photography, but it's also about our relationship with images, and that could be a whole new direction for someone to make an edit and yet another book from Nagarajan's work. And this is just images I found from the book. So who knows how much more there is in his archive that he may not have paid attention to. I think in photography, we make the images and we make a book and we think this is it. Now I've made a book of chairs and that image was in chairs and now I'm not going to use it again. But there are hundreds and hundreds of unrealized images. So the time when we make the image is not really the date that we should give to the image, but the time when we realize it. And what happens when we realize an image in 5 different contexts? So there's a picture of mine of the girl sleeping on the bed, which some of you may have seen. It's the key picture in my book, Go Away Closer, but it's also in the Little Ladies Museum. It's also in my Ladies of Calcutta. It's also in my Bed Museum. So photography has this wonderful possibility of being realized again and again and again in different contexts and in different mediums. It's one thing as a projection, it's one thing as a print on the wall, it's another thing as a book. And hundreds of other possibilities which we have now with all the different media. So I'm still looking at Nagarajan's potential museum of photography. And then I wanted to talk about this image, because the other thing I have always been, not the other thing, but one of the themes that has always interested me is what Satyajit Ray did to photography in India. And I'm not sure if it was just Satyajit Ray, or if Satyajit Ray had been looking keenly at William Gedney's work. And here, I think, is Nagarajan responding to Charulata, or Satyajit Ray seeing this image of Nagarajan and composing Charulata. At a certain point, it doesn't sort of matter which way it happened, but we can certainly see that there's a lot of photography of his time, I think even up to my time, or maybe even younger, the influence of Satyajit Ray and his filmmaking on the kind of photographs we make, and especially when it comes to addressing architecture, people within their architectural spaces. So that's another possibility for someone, some young art historian wanting to make a work around photography. It seems to be the flavor of the month. And this was a quote that Manju found in the book in the biography that Nagarajan had written himself. All homes are built in the mind, not built of brick and mortar, but built of fond memories of events, of births, deaths, and celebrations. The house contains our dreams, T.S. Nagarajan. And this is certainly something you feel in every image of his. So there is the photographic aspect, there is the spiritual aspect, there is the documentary aspect.